I was told when I went into the English theatre that I had what was then known as a colonial accent. Now, this interests me very much indeed, because I had to correct my speech, which I do not find the average young actor, I say average, because I certainly don't, I want to generalize, but the average young American actor, I do not find him at all conscious of his inadequacies in speech. And consequently, there are times when you go to hear plays of Shakespeare played, and I don't want necessarily to say that you must have a British accent or a typically English accent, but I think there ought to be some universal English which is acceptable on both sides of the water, but which has no accent of any particular kind. We certainly don't want the Oxford accent. Equally, we can't have a Southern accent, and we can't have a Midwestern accent when you get into Shakespeare. I think speech is enormously important, and I do not think it's given anything like enough attention.
A general voice devoid of accent?
As nearly as possible. I suppose every one of us, to some extent, has, you know, this is something that I do like to talk about, because I maintain that there is no such thing as an English accent, and there's no such thing as an American accent. There are inflections used by speakers in both countries which differentiate. I think you might say that it would be interesting to hear Mr. Eden speaking with Mr. Roosevelt, and I don't think any of us could say which spoke the better English.
Let's go back to your own early background. I'm curious about the fact that you were born in South Africa.
Well, this is a pure chance. I mean, without...
your parents
I mean, my father was English, my mother was Irish. And my father was a prospecting mining engineer, and he went to Johannesburg, South Africa, at the time that the gold and diamond rush was on. Like a very wise man, he went to see what he could find. And little Basil was due at that time and refused to wait. So he arrived on June the 13th, and there was nothing I could do about it, or mother or anybody else.
Well, according to the record, your first stage appearance was in 1911.
I think it was April 1912. Doesn't me think, because I came to this continent. No, it was April 1912, Shakespeare's birthday, day before, April the 22nd, 1912.
And you've been an actor all your life.
Well, I won't have been an actor. I've been learning to act all my life.
And making a very good living doing it.
I remember very well that in, let me see, it was when we played The Captive in New York, which was 1926, and at that time I had already been in the theater. 1912 to 26 is what? 14 years.
Yes.
I remember turning to Arthur Hornblow and saying to him, Arthur, this is the first time that I really feel confident in myself. It had taken me 14 years to reach a point where I could walk out onto a stage and felt that I was on top of the part and the part was not on top of me. And the trouble today is that I think that the early making a star as early as he and she are sometimes made. Now, this is a very difficult situation for young actors, because the moment or a young actor, the moment you become a star, the director treats you with some deference. You are supposed to know a great many things that you do not know. Therefore, nobody's going to teach you. And I think early stardom is a very great detriment to the actor or actress.
Well, your early career, again, was interrupted by the First World War. You served with the British Army as a lieutenant, and again, according to the record, you have a military cross. Now, I wonder if
an awful lot of people who got military crosses. They used to turn up in all sorts of funny places. I'm glad to say I wasn't a lieutenant until I had already served my time as a private. I joined the army as a private and left as or rather was demobbed in 1918 as a lieutenant, as I'm getting used to saying lieutenant. But the only reason I got an MC was because I did the job I was told to do, and I did it efficiently.
Well, we won't ask you any more about that. But you went right back to acting after the armistice of 1918.
Yes, I went straight back to Stratford-on-Avon and picked up where I left off.
In Shakespeare?
Yes.
This,
and my first 3 years of training, I played 53 roles in 22 plays of Shakespeare.
22 plays of Shakespeare?
22, yeah.
That, I think, would help that diction problem we were talking about.
Yes, it's, besides my old master, Sir Frank Benson, who, as you know, originated the Stratford-on-Avon Festival, he absolutely insisted on the words of Mr. Shakespeare being heard and spoken properly.
Let's speak of a phase of your career offstage. You and Mrs. Rathbone were once great socialites in Hollywood,
Well,
noted
no.
for your lavish parties.
No, this has been a terrible, this is something we don't like at all. We were not socialites. It so happened that during the war, I was president of British War Relief on the coast. And we were asked by the consulate and also from Washington if we would act as official host and hostess for the British colony during the period of visiting firemen. The consul himself was much too busy to attend to those kind of things. And for example, the consul would get on the phone and say, Mrs. Rathbone, Admiral Halsey will be in town over the weekend. What can you do? Consequently, we got our names into the newspapers a great deal for being socialites. I can't think of any word that I really loathe more.
Tell me, did you enjoy your years in Hollywood?
I happen to have enjoyed them to a considerable extent from 1939 to 1946, because those
Hollywood.
were the years of the war. And the war years were very thrilling for us because, having written to the War Office in London and offered my services, I got a form letter advising me that I was far too old to join in this campaign, which I don't pretend that I was too sorry about. But we then settled down to do what we could. We visited hospitals, we visited camps, we gave shows, and we entertained the visiting firemen. And it was I wouldn't have met half the people I have met if it hadn't been for the war years and happening to be in Hollywood at that time.
Let's talk about Sherlock Holmes. Now, when and how did you get into the part of Sherlock Holmes?
It's terribly, terribly simple. At Mr. Zanuck's dinner one night, Gregory Ratoff and Jean Marquis were his guests to dinner, just the three of them sitting there. And one of them simply said out of nowhere, "Why hasn't anybody done the stories of Sherlock Holmes?" And one or the other said, "Yes, why not?" And Zanuck said, "Let's do them." And Ratoff said, "Who's to play Holmes?" And Jean Marquis said, "Who? Basil Rathbone." That's all there was to it.
Well, the critics have said that your interpretation of Holmes is pretty well definitive. How do you feel about the characterization? Could he have existed? Is he a credible man?
Oh, I think he's an extremely credible man. I personally do not feel that Conan Doyle's stories have lived because they are the best mystery stories. I don't think they are. But I think what makes the stories live are the wonderful characterizations that Sir Arthur drew. Holmes is a much more important man than just a detective, than just the analyzer of crimes. He was a very remarkable man. Dr. Watson was one of the most lovable characters of all time, and Moriarty was one of the most shrewd and vicious villains that was ever written. But these are people that I think, personally, perhaps that was part of the success of our little venture in these Sherlock Holmes stories, was that we all loved the people that we played. I've said to my wife once, you know, the one thing I should dread more than anything in the world would be to find myself at a dinner party seated next to Sherlock Holmes, because he'd frighten the daylights out of me.